hand over to you and you can direct the traffic, so to speak.
That's very kind. Look, just in the interest of time, and I've let Gary know that we're really pressed for time, but just look, thanks for the opportunity to introduce this. This paper is, and more the report is really a bit of context and scene setting. It builds on work that we've previously done in relation to the impacts of changed water security. But in this time, instead of asking what are the impacts of different policy settings or and allocation frameworks on water security, it asks a sort of a slightly more difficult and complex question in terms of what are the impacts of Mother Nature, and obviously that's very difficult to model and understand. But we understand the trends of climate change, and we have a sense that that it is going to mean less water or a more volatile supply of water in our environment. So this work, this is a beginning phase of this work. This work will be built on and expanded over time as part of the water security package as we factor and extend our analysis into other aspects of water security. But the reason we've begun, I suppose, with the impacts on the primary sector, very much because the primary sector uses can be measured quite well. And they also, because of where they sit in the allocation framework, they are potentially the most vulnerable or the most exposed to less water because, of course, the first allocation of water is to the environment, the second is to people, and then the subsequent is to extractive use. So this is so I will just hand over to Dr. McDonald, and he can do a brief introduction of himself. And in case you can't see his slides, I'll just mirror his slides on the top screen here. So over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just getting my slides ready. I don't think it'll take too much to do that. So you should see this slide deck there, and I'll just run through them. So yes, I'm Gary McDonald. I'm a Director of Market Economics in Takapuna. My background is in ecological economics. I study both the environment and also the economy and bring those together. And I've worked on a number of water projects throughout New Zealand, including the tank process, which actually feeds inputs into this project, and also the successful Lake Rotorua study undertaken about 6 months ago, and also work in the Makari Aquifer in Gisborne, which is close to you guys. I'm just going to be talking today about the economic impacts of water security in the Tank and Tukituki catchments. Obviously that piece of work wasn't done by myself, it was done by a number of others. It was done by Juan and by Nikki there. Unfortunately, Juan's father passed away from COVID-19 actually in El Salvador about 2 weeks ago, so we battled our way through that as well, but we were able to get through everything. So just moving on, did you see that jump to the next slide there, Tom? That did come through to the next slide, or is it you've got a full picture of the slide?
No, I have.
Right.
You haven't.
Right, just give me a second. That's okay, you can see it all. No, that's fine, no worries. Okay, so basically what we've got there is the objective of the study was, as Tom laid out, was basically put the economic implications of a do-nothing scenario, basically on the water security in the Tank and Tukituki catchments under climate change. And as Tom pointed out, it's very difficult, particularly with the timeframes of climate change. At the moment, we're really looking at something that's going to really exacerbate over the next 20 to 30 years and then really increase as we head out into 260 through to 2100. Just moving on. So I'm onto the slide, is water security and demand under climate change scenarios. And you'll see there the starting point for our analysis is that we start with various RCPs, which are the representative concentration pathways that have been developed from the IPCC. And basically they've got ones there go from 2.6 through to 8.5. The 2.6 one we can basically rule out already. We're not going to meet the requirements of that scenario that the IPCC have done. We're already in excess of the actual concentration of that. So it's very unlikely that will be relevant, but the ones from RCP 4.5 through to 8.5 will be, and we had looked at all of those through it. So NEWA, basically what they do in doing this work is that they start with those concentration ratios in the atmosphere, and then they've taken those and they've looked at those across New Zealand as a whole, running models that are more finer grain. But for our ones, we're not just interested in climate. Obviously, we're interested in what's happening with the water in relation to the climate change. So NIWA has worked on a number of models that allow us to go from the climate change and the climate variables through to what's happening with water. And we're particularly interested in work that was done in 2018, 2016, and also 2019, which they're just about to release, which allows us to look at about 7-kilometre grids across all of New Zealand. And we've used work from that study that allow us to look at what's happening hydrologically in New Zealand under the various RCPs. And you'll see there on your right is there's graphs that basically show the water flow reliability as well as short soil moisture. And we've used those water flow as a representative, as a proxy for what will happen with supply, and soil demand and soil moisture, as a proxy for what will happen with demand. I have been told by NIWA, and we did consult with them quite extensively when we were going through this process, that those really are representative. The other thing they wanted to make very clear was that they feel that the mid-century results that we're likely to see with regards to climate change are really, at the moment, they can't see much statistical difference in climate variability from what we have today. But as it accelerates post about 2050, we really start to see those changes. So if you look at that little graph on the left there, you'll see that under those climate changes around 2050, the scenarios other than the 8.5 one are all pretty much aligned, especially if you go back to 2040, they're all starting from a similar point, but they take different trajectories through that. But by the time we get up to 2100, there's real distinct differences between those. And at the moment, we're looking at somewhere between that the RCP 4.5 and the one for 8.5 along that. So we consider that as a range for us. Just moving on to the next slide, and in that one there, I'm not going to go into this one too much typical, this is a real economist slide, but basically what it tells us is that we've created a relationship between water and irrigation days and actual revenue from farm systems budgets, and then we've linked that to the wider economy to look at what the wider impacts are. What I'll say here is that this work's basically developed out of a number of range of sources that the council has done previously, and that's work around the tank work that was undertaken. There was really good work there undertaken by Ag First that basically looked at different horticultural crops and also pastoral farming, and it developed sets of accounts for different levels of water provisioning. And then from that, we were able to, using this work, we were able to provide a curve that relates us from revenue, basically water irrigation days through to revenue. And that flows into our models. But we do that for both irrigated crops, and those are the ones we've got really good understanding, but we also know that there's also, on the next slide, we can see that there's revenue impacts on non-irrigated dry stock and dairy farms as well. We've incorporated them in there as well. There's not many dairy farms in the tank area, but there is quite a few dairy farms, or increasingly so, in the actual Tukitoki, and even further south there's quite a few dairy farms in the Hawke's Bay region. So we've made sure that we've accounted for those. So we've basically looked at all farming. We haven't looked at forestry, and we haven't looked at municipal uses of water, but obviously a lot of the water that has been used is associated with farming, but it's also associated with the processing of farming products through various processes through the region. So, and we've followed good practice by following what the IPCC does, and that we've looked at what's called these SRES scenarios, and they're basically a special report on emission scenarios that was developed in 2000. It's a protocol around how you do reporting on climate change and look at the economic consequences of those. So we've used those, and we've looked at that for these different farm systems to make sure that for non-irrigated, we've captured the impacts correctly. These are some of the results on the direct impacts. So this gives us a bit of an idea of what we're likely to see. And it's the trend that I really want you to look at, in the increasing trend. So if you look from RCP 2.6 through to RCP 8.5, what you see is increasingly the situation is getting lost. We're likely to see, with respect to a 1998 baseline, we're likely to see, significant losses in the economic production associated with that. And what you really see there through there's a little bit of an increase in RCP 2.6 in late century for pastoral farming, but if you look through the others, the decline is what you're seeing. You are starting to see significant declines in some of the key industries that make up the Hawke's Bay, around pip fruit, grapes, stone fruit, and then also even by the time you get up to 8.5 late century, you're starting to see pasture significant pasture impacts. And what's important, these losses at the moment don't indicate that we would run into climate change, would run into land use change associated with this, but we know that it's getting very marginal by the time we get out to 2016. And beyond 2060, it's likely we'll actually start to see industries that they can't actually make profit out of the current production processes that they have, and those will lead to further impacts beyond that. And our study covers that period from 2020 to 2060. So we are likely to see reasonably big impacts, and particularly beyond 2060. So we must keep that in mind when looking at these charts. We convert that first set of absolute impacts into relative impacts, which we actually integrate into our modelling. There's nothing much in that slide to say other than it generally shows the same directional change as the previous slide. It's just that we prefer to have it in that particular way. That allows us to connect it to the rest of the economy modelling and see what will happen as a result of these changes as they flow through the wider economy. So, but when we do look at the wider economy, it's important that we have a range of reference scenarios. One of the key things that's really come out from climate change and looking at long-term futures, and particularly from an economics perspective, but also from a range of perspectives, is that we don't just consider one future. No one knows what the future is going to be. We can't predict it. There's no certainty 100% around that. So what we're tending to do today in terms of reporting those consequences is say, look, there's a range of possible futures. And what you have here is a little table that shows a number of futures that we looked at. We looked at ones that ran from heavily normal baseline activity under a kind of a business usual scenario, right through to technological futures, which you could say would be a Trumpian world, something that's just driven by technological change, right through to green orientated futures where the world might be more sustainable, that we have a much better connection with our land base. There's the arangatanga, relationship well-being, human well-being to environmental well-being, connecting those two things together in that scenario. That gives us a range which we can look out into the future within. So when we're looking at that whole wider economy, we're considering these possible pathways that the economy might grow within. And that means that we can set our results in those futures rather than just in what has been done traditionally, which is a business as usual future. And that's necessary because we are looking at very long time periods. Short term, you could use business as usual, but we already know that the business as usual is not the future we're going to be seeing if we push out 20, 30, and even out to 100 years from now. So what we do with all of those scenarios and all the direct results and the impacts on those farm systems and in terms of their water requirements and feeding them in is we feed them into a model of the whole Hawke's Bay economy, but we also realise that the Hawke's Bay economy is linked with the rest of New Zealand economy. And from that we take basically those horticultural, fruit growing, pastoral, irrigated, non-irrigated impacts under the various RCPs, those representative concentration pathways, and we also feed them in there with our reference futures for wider economic conditions. And those conditions relate to not just what's in the Hawke's Bay, they relate to the Hawke's Bay, they relate to the rest of New Zealand and the rest of the world in terms of its trajectories that it's on. We feed them through that model. Actually, that model was developed out of the Resilience National Science Challenge, so it's a massive investment. And in fact, it has already been used in the Hawke's Bay to look at water and coastal inundation issues under climate change and what the economic consequences may be associated with that under the EDGE program there. So we were able to pick that model up, it was in existence, and actually apply that and link in the previous data to that model. There was some work involved in doing that, that's not straightforward, but we were able to do that from it. So using that integrated model, which is a real step change from what we saw in the tank modelling of 2 years previously, this has that ability to look much further. We will then get an idea on what the impacts are longer term. So flicking over to the next slide. In here you can see this chart, and it's got all these figures that actually show under those different RCPs and under those different reference scenarios for the economic conditions, different pathways that it will take. Don't worry about the detail, it's not the detail that tells the picture. The picture here is the general trend. The trend is a downward trend. Under all options, what we are likely to see is significant losses across the Hawke's Bay region associated with climate change and water security issues. And really importantly, what I'll say is that that takes us out to 2060. But those trends, when we look at them, it really increase beyond 2060. So while we're not going to see that much change, $50 million, say on average, through to about 2040 losses, by the time we get up to 2100, those are much, much larger. Our modelling can only run to 2060, but we could see also that the trend in the climate change data was telling us that they're likely to have really significant ones by the time we get to 2100. So don't think of the graph as just stopping at 2060. It's just that that's the limitation of the modelling we can do. There certainly is going to be significant impacts beyond that. So, but in the table that sits alongside that graph, what we've done is we've actually taken under those various RCPs, under RCP 4.5 and 8.5, we've taken all of the scenarios that relate to 4.5, so that techno global scenario to the green growth scenario, we've taken those and we've run it and we've created an average impact just to give a bit of an idea what would happen there. Of course, all the detail for each one of these sits in the technical report that accompanies the work, but I just wanted to show you the overall big picture change there. And what we can kind of see is that in 2030, the impacts aren't very big. We're talking about 30 million and RCP 4.5. By the time we get up to 2060, that's grown to 110 million, and a little bit more under RCP 8.5 of around $120 million. And to put that in perspective, what that represents today is the entire accommodation sector within the Hawke space, all operations of accommodation. If you were to look at those, that would be equivalent to the complete loss of that from the economy. It also represents around about 8.3% of the total agricultural production. And by production, what I'm meaning there is the farming systems plus all the processing associated with them. Those two together, by the way, make up about 20% of your economy. And so we're saying that of that 20% of the whole economy, 8% of that 20% is actually what this impact actually looks like. So it's reasonably significant. And we shouldn't lose sight that that's going to accentuate as well. The important thing to realise from that, you'll see from that table, is that the impacts aren't just Hawke's Bay's issue. They're an issue for the whole of New Zealand. And I expect by the time we looked at other regions, the ones will exacerbate through that. So what you'd like to see with the water security issues in Hawke's Bay are going to flow through into the rest of the country. So, and I think that's something in terms of how we deal with the problem going forward. We need to think of initiatives. And I think that there's a need for central government to realise that they have a role in that process too, because it's going to affect others, not just the Hawke's Bay and its solely. Taking that perspective, and I think one thing that, those are year-on-year results that I've shown today, but the reality is that what we're going to see is those are going to compound through time. The important thing there to remember is that those results are year on year. You get those $120 million losses, sure, in 2060, but every year before that, there has been losses that have been accumulating through that process. Those losses to the economy over a long period like that can have significant impacts on communities. They also have a significant impact on the environment itself. And of course, that environment underpins everything in the community. So it's really important that we address start to look at mitigations and adaptations that we can make in respect to climate change. In this table, this final table, which talks about the net present value, I've tried to look at what that cumulative impact is over the time, 2020 to 2060. And you can see that the numbers range between about 1 billion and 2 billion, depending on the actual discount rate that you apply. And with regard to climate change, a lot of economists today are starting to say, look, it's not even appropriate to apply a discount rate. It should be the full figures. So even at a 4% discount, you can see that they're up around that 2 billion mark. But I suspect if we went down to zero, there'd be more like $5 or $6 billion impacts cumulative over that 40-year period. So that gives you a bit of an idea. There's more detail, obviously, in the technical report that's going to do that, to look into that, so you can look at that and have a bit more information on that. The big conclusions from the work really is that, well, by mid-century, the climate change impacts are really within the normal range of climate variability. That's what the NEMA scientists are telling us. But as you progress prior to post-2040, particularly 2050 onwards, you really are starting to see quite significant impacts. And those will become very, very big beyond 2060. By the time you're at 2100, they're enormous. So The socio-economic impacts I feel will be felt increasingly through time. So I think that's important, but also what we're going to see, and I think that this is reflective of the current drought situation throughout the country in a number of areas, we're also like to see an increase in volatility of extreme events. So the modelling work that we've done is really based on the average style impacts, but what we are likely to see is quite big volatile differences as we move through time. Those increases are going to become bigger. So we will get more extreme events as we pass through. Also, in our study, we've just looked at water security, and obviously climate change has other effects. As I mentioned earlier, it has an effect on what's happening with coastal inundation and on sea level rise in coastal communities. And I think if you bring all of that together, the impacts are bigger than what we've just shown here, which is just purely related to water security issues. I think there are other issues that need to be accounted for as well. I'm a strong believer in this next point, which is really that the impacts on the environment, habitats and ecosystems really underpin everything that we do. For me, that's the Aotearoa component of it. It's the wellbeing of the environment and what that means in terms of going forward. I also what that means for human activity. That underpins everything that our economies are based on. So it's really critical that we provide for them first. Obviously, in your order, if you look at Te Mana Roti Wai, the requirements of councils today to provide for the environment, provide for people, and then provide for the extractive uses beyond that. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind in the decision processes going forward. Obviously, the well-being of the people in the communities is based out of the environmental component. So that's the rangatangata in terms of that's really important to the well-being of people going forward as well. So there's a lot of catchments that are dependent upon their pastoral farming uses that are in lockstep with in lockstep basically with the primary sector and its fortunes. So we need to consider that. The final real conclusion is that the impacts of Hawke's Bay water security will not only be felt locally but also through the whole of New Zealand. And I think if we start to look at other regions, yes, Hawke's Bay will also experience effects of what will happen in other regions in reverse. So that's important to take into consideration too in a wider assessment. And that's really my presentation. So any questions, I'll be most welcome to answer them.
Thank you, Rex. Questions?
Tom, you got anything you want to add? Okay, questions.
I've just got a couple. Thank you very much indeed, Gary. That's very informative as a baseline for the do nothing. I was just intrigued. The table 3. It seems I might be reading it wrong, but it seems that the Hawke's Bay has got a sort of a 3/4 of the country's hit at 2030, but only a quarter of the country's hit at 2060.
Yeah, no, that table, I'll correct the interpretation there. So the table there is Hawke's Bay's impact on the rest of New Zealand. So that's not New Zealand's impact in total. So it's just what would happen as a result of it. What we're really saying is that the impacts occur not just in Hawke's Bay, but there is also really considerable impacts beyond into New Zealand.
Yeah, I understand. It's just it looked like that there's a total New Zealand hit in 2030 of minus 40% or whatever, 30% of which is Hawke's Bay, and then in 2060 there's a total hit of minus 400, and you know we seem to be having a bigger hit in the shorter term than in the long term. Or am I misreading that?
No, you're right. That is the way it plays out more in terms of Hawke's Bay doesn't see those impacts as greatly in those early years. And I think that actually relates to the climate variability component. It's, for us, that initial mid-century one, there isn't a lot there and those numbers move around a bit. So they're probably the ones that are spurious. I think the ones that are more accurate are the ones when you get longer out in terms of the directional change. So yeah, you're going to see a lot more in the New Zealand context in that second half of the century.
He's the back of the truck, doesn't he?
Any more questions? Just Neil and then Craig.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gary. Look, I just want to go to the your data and your methodology.
Yes.
In terms of, have you factored in opportunity cost as well? If I know this is zero based, but to run fast to stand still, we've got to undertake a whole range of actions. Have you factored that in to your figures?
Yeah. Yes, I think that when we were looking at the tank process looked at what would happen for that, and that's where the data for those irrigated farmers come through, and that's where the biggest impact is directly. And in the consideration there was what would they do as the next best alternative through that process. So they did assess that. One thing they didn't do in that process is that they basically said that the hit would be taken by the farm owners in terms of EBIT changes, and they didn't look like what would happen with regards to the expenses. And those expenses we would argue that they may change just as much as the actual, the actual profit that was made by businesses through that. And that's why I think it's really important in terms of opportunity costs. So we tracked through our study, we also tracked the EBITDA of the businesses, and we were seeing that as we went out about to 2006, just beyond that, we start to see a situation where negative operating surpluses arrive. And what that really means is that those businesses would start to look at other alternatives. And those alternatives could be significant. For example, they might change the land use, which they're doing, and that probably would go to a less economic, would produce less value added per hectare than what they currently do today. That would be one thing. The second thing is they may just redirect their investment. And I'm thinking particular of different types of the farms. I know very well that in talking to the First Agriculture and Commerce who prepared that data, that they said that the gimlet gravels, for example, are very high production, but there isn't really an alternative use for them other than forestry. They're not very good for pastoral, and they're not very good for anything else. So, the change could be dramatic there. So in terms of opportunity costs, it's really just on the horizon. They would really start to kick in beyond that 2060 mark if the EBIT falls, becomes negative. And personally in that study, I didn't believe that the farmers would just react by purely taking the hit. I actually felt that the actual they would actually start to look at their expense change and start to change that. My experience of farmers, and coming from a family farming background, is that farmers are quite creative and they can think through alternatives to better use and manage their resource, and will be able to mitigate some of that. I don't believe all of that is built in. So some of it's there, some of it isn't. I think the big hit on opportunity cost kicks in beyond 2016.
Chair, there was a slide about the middle when you commented on it. It said the impacts are about 30 million by 2030, I think, and then at 2060 it was quite pronounced. It accelerated up. Yeah, that one. But that kind of implies to me that within 5 years you're seeing an economic impact. But I also interpret that as, well, 5 years ago, from 15 to 20, you must have begun to see some economic impact. Because you're not... can you explain that? Because it hasn't suddenly started happening. There's a trend.
No, it hasn't. And as I say, I mean, even though we got negative results there of that change, like there was going to be reduction, like I say, we still believe that those results are reflective of current climate variability. So they were built into the data sets. And then for us, that would be statistically not certain. We just don't know. There's very little change from the current climate scenario. So, but you're right, there's probably a gradual change through the whole process as, CO2 equivalent emissions and concentrations have occurred across the planet. It's slowly been a slow degradation, although we can't see that statistically in our data. It's certainly that's going to be a progression that's going to go through. So for the NIWA scientists, that 2030 to 2040 period is where we start to begin to see the change. So those early results, like I say, I'm not as comfortable with those as I am with the end ones, because they're far more definitive in terms of the directional change. So they will be big.
Thanks.
Wish I could be more precise on it, but.
Yeah, thank you very much for quite an in-depth report. I possibly need to bathe in it for another, 4 or 5 days before I fully understand what it actually means to all of us. But can you just explain to me, it's on the slides with the maps on it, if you can just pull it up, Tom, please. Now, I've been involved donkey deep in tank. We still have wet water then. Initially, we were taught that and told that the coast itself would be drier, but closer to the ranges wouldn't be so much of an issue, and that the main pressure would be on the plains. However, these maps are showing different. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, you are, and this is because it's this is NIWA's 2016 edition of their maps. They produced a 2018 report, which has a little bit different in its results, but generally the same changes, but they don't have that down to the regional level. So we relied on the 2016 data from it. They are updating that to 2019, and they're trying to put statistical bounds around that so we get a bit more certainty. But the trends that you outline are trends that I would have expected to see. Also in here, what you've got 2.6 to 8.5, and this is what I haven't put in there, and I should have put in this title, is that this is for RCP 4.5. If you were to look at RCP 8.5, I think the trends you're talking about would come out. So I'll make sure that that's in the report so that you can see that. That will be far more definitive because that's much further in the future, and those trends should appear at the end. Sorry, I should have actually put that down to say that it was RCP 4.5, not 8.5.
Supplementary, Gareth?
Yes, supplementary, Mr. Chair, through you. And that points to me, it's not the water that actually falls on the Hiratonga Plains that are critical to it. Actually, what falls on the headwaters. And so
yes,
by
correct.
looking at these maps here, definitely there's an exacerbation of the effects of climate change that we will feel on the Hiratonga Plains. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. And I think one thing that's important, I didn't say earlier on, and it's because I'm not a climate scientist, although I know a little bit about it, is that these guys have just using surface water hydrological models and surface water connected ones with what happens within the groundwater system below. And that's really, really important when you start looking at the aquifers. That at the moment is not fully captured in it because at the moment they're just looking at the surface water components of their hydrological modelling. The linking between the groundwater and the hydrological and the surface water components is something that they really have struggled with, and they're still doing. And I'm sure that you're aware of that from talking to your own hydrologists within the council. It is still working. It's the science around that is still being developed.
Any more questions? Oh, James got a
So that's
question.
one. Gary, the RCPs presumably come from Assessment Report 2014,
Yes.
which would have been largely assembled in the years preceding that. So we're obviously 6 years on from when those were issued, and we now have an Earth system model being built for New Zealand that we didn't then. Based
Correct.
on your discussions with NIWA, would you say on the balance of probabilities that these predictions are conservative, and there's probably more downside risk than upside risk into the future on those?
It's a really good question and a really relevant question. I think first thing I would say is RCP 2.6, you can basically drop it out. It's just not going to happen. We're ahead of that. And I would say from that reason, we are conservative. I think 8.5 is pretty strong. It's pretty way out there at the moment. And I wouldn't want to say that it's going to be more than that. If our current bad practice globally continues, then yes, it could be. But hopefully we will start to address some of those issues around climate change around the rest of the world. I mean, it's an inherited problem for us. And I know talking to councils, I'm always saying, look, you inherited this problem, it's your problem to try and deal with it now. That seems very, very unfair because there's not a lot that you can do in your local area to reduce those emissions. But I mean, in New Zealand, we're trying to do that. We certainly are trying to address our own emissions. But we inherited the problem from the rest of the world's bad practices as well. But I agree, I think that you are looking at something that's closer to, certainly above 4.5, but it's probably below 8.5 if I can say it conservatively like that.
Any more
And
questions?
forget about 2.6.
Just one comment. Just talking to Will before, just did a quick maths. There's actually two people in this room, Henawai and Will, that possibly will see 2016. So it's actually not that far away. It's actually reality in their lifetime. So just keep it in context, you know.
I wouldn't put money on me seeing it, that's for sure.
I never mentioned your name, Mr. Chair.
Are we 94?
You might get there.
Well, if we get everybody on a bike, maybe we might get some of us there, you know.
So anyway, this is your problem, mate. You got a question?
No questions.
Can I just clarify that the net, if you didn't have the discount rate, the figure you gave was $5 to $6 billion cumulative hit across the 100 years. It was
it's across the 40 years, 2020 to 2060, and the discount rates are 4% and 6%. And you notice I didn't use Treasury's once suggested 8%. I simply don't believe it. I think it's going to be more like the 4 to 6%. And I don't think we can think of natural resources as having discount rates. And like I said before, I think with many economists today are now starting to really question the use of discount rates with natural resources.
2060.
Okay, are there any other questions? Well, thank you, Gary. It was a very extensive report and very enlightening. We're clearly going to be challenged in the future, and doing nothing is certainly not an option for the people that live, especially on the Heretaunga Plains, and where they live in Central Hawke's Bay too. So we really appreciate all the work you've done, and hope you're having a nice day in Takapuna. That's my old hunting ground.
We are. It's a rainy day here, which we certainly need.
Oh, you need water. You need water in Auckland more than we need it here, so.
Yeah, I think across the whole country, actually. We need water. Well, certainly in the North Island anyway.
So really appreciate the work that you have done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You guys will have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Okay, Tom, do you have anything you want to finish off on it?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to present that, and I think, like to James's point, I think when you read the report, given the narrowness of its focus and some of the assumptions around, that people will continue operating as revenues have fallen into, even though they've got revenues, they're in a negative profit situation. I think it probably does sort of somewhat ironically represent something of a best case optimistic scenario. So.
You want to move it?
Now, I've got a question for Tom, and that's not actually in relation to this particular report. And it may be a stupid question. Have we done, because we talk about economy here and the economics of what is coming towards us, have we done a similar report, just looked at the environment? If we did nothing, what would the environment look like in 2060, 100? I'm not saying that that's where we should go or that's what we should do to get a report, but have we got any idea what that looks like?
That would be a really interesting question.
So I think that's, so happily, as I said at the start, this is the first step in a longer process, and we certainly expect, because we really need to provide you with tools that you can look at information to make decisions on. And the reason we started here is because, as you mentioned, in terms of Te Manaroto Wai, the first allocation is to the environment and then to people, and so we're kind of reversing that out, what happens, because last on, first off, so to speak. But I certainly anticipate that through the regional water assessment, which has a natural capital, a natural capital aspect to it, that we will help develop that picture.
Thank you. On that note, Jeff, will you move this report? Receive this report?
Yep,
Do we have a seconder for that? Martin, looks enthusiastic. Thank you. Do you wish to speak further, Martin? Anyone else wish to speak? I do, because I think this has been great work, Tom, that you've initiated here. And we do need to know this. It's confirming a lot of our prejudices, I guess, and thoughts. And taking Jerev's point, it'd be really interesting if we did absolutely nothing, what in particular, where I live, what Heretaunga would look like in 50 years' time. It would be a real, it would be a desert. So, possibly.
Can I have a question, Mr. Chair? Just sorry to come on.
Well, you're taking liberties.
Yeah, liberty.
We'll move in a second. Okay, you're on.
Just in terms of the next steps for that type of report, we've got that pretty focused on pastoral farming effects, but what's our potential to gather in all the effects across the board? So reporting a similar report based on the global consequences we're dealing with, a big picture.
So that's the next phase, certainly in terms of the work that the regional water assessment is going to do. This is sort of like the kicker off, and that will then, really investigate what's our industrial and domestic use of water. So we've got a good sense of all the water and all those impacts.
I probably meant, aside from water,
Yeah.
climate change issues across the board. How do we articulate those?
So perhaps I can respond to that. So the National Science Challenge on Climate Change that's currently underway is looking at all of those broader impacts, and part of that is the completion, which is now up and running, is the New Zealand Earth System model, which provides New Zealand specific modelling of climate change impacts, and from everything from temperature, precipitation, what have you. And then there's a whole bunch of work streams to translate that into analysis for things like biodiversity, flood risk, coastal inundation, all the elements of climate change. So that's being done at the national level with the ability to scale down to regional level. At the moment, we don't have any science planned by the Regional Council to be procured from that, but I'm happy to engage with the National Science Challenge and see what opportunities there are for Hawke's Bay Regional Council to draw a regional scale analysis out of that and bring that back to Council.
Thank you.
You happy with that?
Absolutely.
Okay, we're moving to seconder. All those in favour? We're just receiving it, remember. Aye. Passed. Thank you very much. So we're going to go back to item 11, corporate and strategic. Neil, so I want you to take that, please.
Just very briefly, Mr. Chair, you recall the remit to local government. That's there. That's a pretty straightforward recommendation. You'll recall the Treasury report, and then we, for your benefit, Mr. Chair, we lay on the table the water security governance model. So we need to come back to that. But those other reports received are in public excluded, which we'll consider as a part of public excluded today. Just an assurance to the public that there are valid and strong reasons for those to have been in public excluded, and they still remain.
Thank you, Neil. You'll be moving.
I move.
Any questions for Neil first before we do that, though? Any questions on this? No, therefore we go for a seconder. Craig, will you second this report, Deputy Chair? Just to speak, Neil, you fine? Craig, any other speakers? Otherwise, we'll move it. All those in favour of receiving report from Corporate and Services and Strategic?
Aye.
Aye. Against? It is carried. So item 12, which is the amended tenders committee, which will be quick as well.
This was just effectively to add the chair of the Finance Audit and Risk Committee to the Tenders Committee, given that the Corporate and Strategic and the Finance Audit and Risk chairs are not the same person in those roles in this triennium.
I'm happy to support that, Mr. Chair. The elevation to this very powerful body is
Means you have to do an extra hour's work today. Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward. We're actually adding to the committee these two people who tend to be involved in our finances. Is there any questions on it? If not, do we have a move? I'll move. Seconder, Jerif. I've got nothing to say except I think it's a very good idea. Jerif, do you wish to speak?
Nope.
Anyone else wish to speak? All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. Now we go to item 14, councillor remuneration. I noticed this little interesting one.
Mr. Chair, can I just give you a quick procedural suggestion?
Yes,
Item 18, the one about procurement policy amendments, it's on our agenda today.
yes.
I've had a quick discussion, and myself and the chair of CNS are quite happy and keen to suggest that we just kick that straight to the next FARS meeting for it to come back up to the main council whenever that next meeting is, because there's quite detailed bits and pieces in there which
There was.
probably need more time than this particular meeting has.
18, we're kicking for touch.
That's the
Does
procurement one.
anyone got any strong objections to that?
It'll come back up through here in a couple of months.
Number
An
18,
issue there?
item 18.
No.
Oh, thank you.
Media are going to leave now, Mr. Chair.
So we are going. We could have come to it when we came to it, but so I think that's right too. There are some complexities which you need to get your head around there first.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Are you okay with that, Mark? You've had the discussion, you can go back to work now.
But you're back for public.
Okay, so let's go to
You're back for tenders.
item 14, councillor remuneration paper.
Yes. Do you want to talk to me too?
Joe.
Okay. This is a pretty straightforward paper regarding the extension as resolved on the 25th of March to include the chair of the Joint Committee on Coastal Hazards with the remuneration factor for other chairs of committees, and also the notification around the change to the chairman's salary with respect to COVID-19. Are there any questions regarding that?
Any questions for Joe? No question? Do we have a
Great.
mover for the paper?
Yep, I'm happy to move.
We'll move. I have a conflict. I should stand aside from this paper, shouldn't I?
Black, white, please, Jeff.
It's just loading.
It's a lot of work, you know, they protected the coast.
Did we have a seconder? Yes, Craig did. He's moving his
Thanks,
pen.
Craig.
Thank you very much. Do you,
Any sugars?
the mover?
No, hopefully that's the end of remuneration talk for this term.
I can't guarantee that.
Craig, no.
The word to know the
All those in
page.
favour of accepting the recommendations?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. So we're on to fixing the common seal. We don't have Rick here to help us. There was an issue there actually. Fixing common seal, page 89. No, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm quite interested what that boundary change was. 1.2. What was that about?
That was in relation to a river berm and river encroachment from memory. I don't have it immediately in front of me, but and Chris Dolly isn't here.
Oh, no, it's not. Maybe someone can give me a ring about that later. Okay, but I would like to know what that boundary change is. Is it changing from a river moving, is it?
Yes. So, yep, the river has. Yep, that's right.
And the river moves, and you make a boundary change. Is that what happens?
We do in relation to the schemes.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Right to the scheme.
And in this case, from memory, there is payment to the landowner for effectively the taking of their property for river control purposes.
Okay.
Because my understanding is that this occurs where the boundary is not fixed by a definite survey, but rather set relative to
By the
a
river.
water line, such as the coastline of
Is
the
that
river.
common?
Yeah, and then the survey regulations are such that there is the doctrine of accretion if it applies on a gradual basis.
Okay. Learned something today. Okay, the recommendation is that we confirm to fix the common seal. Do we have someone to move to do that on those two?
I'll move.
Jerv's going to move. He's back from coastal erosion. Seconder, Charlie. All those in favour?
Aye.
Thank you very much. We have item 16, Hbrook. Table of intent. Kirshen, you sent him away.
He
Emailed
was
him.
here, but he seems to have disappeared, but
I emailed him to say it was up now.
Okay,
Jess, you can do
I can talk to this paper.
Okay,
So the
thanks.
statement of intent, the draft statement of intent was reviewed and discussed at the Corporate and Strategic Committee meeting. So there was no substantive feedback in terms of inclusion or amendment to the statement. So I think it is presented as is, as
Yeah.
was at CNS for adoption. We just need to adopt it before the 30th of June to comply with legislation.
And can I perhaps just add to that? I think the discussion at the time was that council does need to have a strategic conversation about the role of Hbrook to reflect that into the statement of intent, but that we would be doing that as part of the development of the investment strategy for the next long-term plan.
and that as this is a statutory requirement, this is effectively a holding position for the time being until that conversation is had and has been landed, at which time we would then reflect it into a revised SOI, and we can revise the SOI by council resolution at any time.
Okay, yeah, I just want to ask you too, are you happy with this, you too?
Yes.
Yes, okay, and you've got some comment?
Yeah, just to add to the Chief Executive's comment is that my view, there needs to be a conversation with councillors and some further direction, even interim direction, as to, for example, our approach to the dividend with the port, so the engagement with the port on dividend, for example, and on those the expectations of the investment portfolio. So there are some interim discussions ahead of what you've just suggested that we should be having. The other question is the service level agreement with council for servicing, and can you tell us where that's up to, Jess, in terms of
I think
almost a
it's,
parallel document?
yes, it is. So that's intended to just sort of document the expectation around the provision of services from HBRC to HBRIC in terms of the running of the organisation and how we expect the flow of information to transact. So we do actually have Kishan as one of our new employees. He's a new management accountant who is an HBRC employee. He's come to us from PwC. We're lucky to have him. So he's providing management accounting services to HBRIC and working alongside the HBRIC directors in Blair in that capacity. He will be preparing the financial statements and the annual report for HBRIC this year, but reports into Bronda, the CFO, as an employee at HBRC. So there's a much sort of tighter alignment, better alignment in terms of the relationship and the flow of information between each party.
Mr Chair, I wonder if we could, though, have councillors have line of sight on that document, perhaps presentation at either FARS or CNS, so that we're clear on that, and perhaps that's the opportunity to express and give some direction about and guidance to the approaches on investment.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. And Kishan, sorry we sent you out of the room. We haven't met you. I'm wondering if you could take a minute and tell us who you are. Could you come up so that the public can also hear who you are? Sorry to put you on.
It's the hot seat. The reject button. If they don't like what they hear.
And thanks for, I noticed you were the top of the list of writing this report, so.
Thank you. I feel like a lamb to the slaughter here, but
You are.
yeah, so Kishan Premadasa, originally from Sri Lanka. So yes, do like my cricket, especially the year 1996 was a good year for us. Since then it's gone a bit downhill, but prior to this I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. I worked in the assurance practice, and I've also done some work in private business, and currently working under Bronda in the finance team, but I also work predominantly in HBRIC in terms of the financial reporting aspect of HBRIC. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Kishan. You've got to watch those HBRIC directors. They're complicated, but so thank you very much for that, and we look forward to having you work for us and with us in the future.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
And
it.
stay with us because I think your next paper is the
Yes.
the funds transfer.
Yeah, we need to go through this one first, though. So we have someone to remove this, move those recommendations.
I'll move.
Thank you very much.
Craig.
Second by Craig. Don't wish to speak anymore, as you already have. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you very much. So we'll go to item 24, which is the HBRIC managed funds transfer.
It came through as a late paper, so it'll be as a separate item in the Stella folder.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Okay,
So I can give you a
obvious.
little bit of an overview of
Yeah,
what we're trying,
okay.
the objective and what we're trying to achieve here, and then Kishan can answer the technical accounting questions. So effectively, when we went into the port IPO, the intention was that we would, all of the funds released through the IPO, or equity released through the IPO, would be effectively held by HBRC and ring-fenced for future ratepayers, and that's what we effectively consulted on. We went into the transaction knowing that we could get a certain percentage of any proceeds back to HBRC without any tax implications. And we also expected at the time we went through some pre-work with Price Waterhouse and the Inland Revenue that subject to a binding ruling that we would be able to repatriate another 35 million without any unfavourable tax implications. Unfortunately, the binding ruling hasn't. The decision hasn't been found in our favour. We're still discussing that with the Inland Revenue, but at this stage, it's not possible to repatriate that 35 million back to HBRC without any tax implications. So we need to, based on that, we do need to look at a way forward in terms of getting those funds back together on HBRC's balance sheet as opposed to HBRIC's. This is effectively a transfer of the New Zealand equities portion of the portfolio back to HBRC, and those funds will effectively join the portfolio that sits on HBRC's balance sheet. So it's really, I think, effectively it's a common sense first step in the process, and we'll be working with HBRIC over the coming months in terms of next steps, in terms of the remainder of the balance that sits there.
Thank you, Jess.
So any tricky accounting questions we can ask Kishan,
It's a pretty simple transaction.
but it is
Wonder we didn't
effectively a
think-
transfer of
So what do the
the
HBRIC
equity and
directors think
a
about
loan
this?
agreement.
We had a discussion. Basically, our concerns were, or first of all, that was at the request of HBRC. We are servants to that master. But the questions were around the risks and any inherent risks, be it tax or otherwise, of this transaction. And the advice we received was it's on the minimal side of risk. There are other larger amounts being considered outside of just the Kiwi portfolio. And we were comfortable with the advice we received that this transaction proceed. There is an informal caveat there that the risks in so far as this goes, there's some issues around this procedurally or as far as taxation, those risks lie with HBRC, not with HBRIC.
Yeah, I probably
But
should
we were
add,
unanimous in
it's certainly the intention, it was never the intention that we would have a significant amount of funds invested in managed funds within HBRIC, which is effectively a taxable environment. So as suggested just earlier, that we will need to work through that, and the suggestion is that HBRIC has its own SIPO, which will differ from HBRC. Obviously the intention was to have all of the funds back at HBRC, so we made the decision just to mirror the SIPO for HBRIC, but we obviously got more out of the transaction than we expected, but we also haven't been able to repatriate as much as what we thought, so therefore there's a larger amount sitting on HBRIC's books.
This is a wonderful transaction and shows the brilliance of the HBRIC directors. We've got your money, we're going to loan it back to you and charge you for it.
Exorbitant interest rate. Okay,
just-
I think...
Just one thing to add on.
Kishan's
Yes,
got
Can I
Kishan.
just add one thing to that, councillors? So basically, the SIPO is designed for a tax-exempt organization, and so by having it in HBRIC, there's a bit of a disjoint there. So this transaction will closely align those funds to be sitting with the intent of the SIPO. So that's definitely one advantage of moving these funds over.
Thank you.
Yes, okay.
I was, just ask a question to make sure I understand simple numbers. We've got 107 from the share sale, 44 is in HBRC, 60 remains with HBRIC. The plan was that 25 would always remain with HBRIC and we'd bring 35 back. That seems to be what I'm reading.
Based on the actual equity released, so when we went into the consultation, we had assumed, we didn't actually think we would get 107. We'd based all of our assumptions on 83, so we actually achieved more.
That's why the 25 would stay in HBRIC, because
That's
it's
right.
kind of like the super profit, if you like.
Yep.
Okay, but instead now of repatriating the 35 back to HBRC because of these tax implications, we're going to take about half of it as a loan,
As a start.
as a start.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with 18 of the 35 that we were going to repatriate.
That's right.
So that's the picture?
Yeah, that's the picture.
That's in the guts.
Do we have someone who will move that then?
And why are we paying HBRIC the 2%?
Because you got to.
Commercial transaction.
You actually have to as a commercial transaction.
So just a question for clarification, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So I take it, Jess,
if the question of tax, if you like, comes in favour of the tax department, not IRD, I take it that the question will be looking about where does the transaction go as far as Hawke's Bay Regional Council and HBRIC. Because at the end of the day, it was about repatriating funds at a tax-free status.
Yes, that's effectively why we would pay interest on the loan at commercial terms, and 2% is considered to be commercial term at current rates.
Yep.
Yeah.
So my question is, if we do arrive at a point where taxes do have to be paid, then it does, will it be revisited, the question about paying the $35 million across, with paying whatever's
Certainly.
owed on them?
We will bring that to you for your consideration. Yeah.
Happy to move, Mr. Chair.
You'll move all recommendations? 1 to 6. And you'll second it, Craig?
I will.
You wish to speak anymore? Anyone else wish to speak? It seems to be a sensible thing to do. Okay, all in favour of the whole 6 recommendations? Aye.
Aye.
Against? It's carried.
Common sense to
Okay, so we have knocked that information item away, so we're on item 20. Council reports, we only have one. Who was that now? Will. That was Will.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. So I can report on the, or give you an update on the Osprey or TB3, now known as Osprey Committee. As Councillor Rep, I attended my second meeting. The first one pre-lockdown was obviously all about the TB outbreak and kind of, who or what to blame and how to manage what they were dealing with. This time, post-lockdown, I would say the biggest issue from affected farmers was the decision by government to not allow continuation of vector control during level 4 of lockdown. So obviously, with the outbreak, as bad as it was, one of the part of the best response to that was obviously vector control and controlling the possums, and they didn't see big risk in that, but the government, even with hard lobbying, the government wouldn't budge on that. So while that's been and gone, there's still a push, if we would ever go to some sort of lockdown again, that there's a, I guess, consideration that vector control can continue. Some of the other issues were around education to the wider farming public around TB. Obviously, these farmers have got this stigma around them now around trading stock and that, even if they've been tested clear or whatever, just around trading stock is still an issue to them, and they believe it's just more of an education campaign that needs to occur amongst the wider farming public. Our pest team leader, Mark Mitchell, is part of that committee too, and always presents from a council point of view of activities. I thought Mark had some good points around monitoring numbers, so they are on the increase, as we've had anecdotal evidence from farmers. Those farmers generally commenting are concerned around possum numbers, and while Mark's saying the monitoring levels are below our target, perhaps we have to review our target level and decrease that, because it may turn out to be higher than it should be. And also around the monitoring frequency, so potentially or perhaps taking too long to get around the full region before they come back to the same place again, and so thinks we need to review that as well. So I thought it was be quite good for perhaps Mark to come and present to us on a lot of that that current information and proposals how we might change or review and change our practices in that area. Possibly the only other thing to comment was assure quality in that committee, and so they're responsible for the TB testing of animals, and Mel on the committee that day just made the comment, and we'll still have numbers to come, but that the amount of cows, so the normal cow herds and numbers that they would be going out to testing right now, he said it's quite frightening, the responses they're getting where the cows just aren't there anymore as because of the drought. And so those numbers will still, official numbers will come from beef and lamb obviously, but yeah, he just made the comment it's not great reading already what the reduced numbers, and I guess should come as no surprise, but obviously will cause a lot of impact for sheep and beef farmers and our economy for a few years for that to recover.
Thank you, Will. Are there any questions for Will specifically on TB and Osprey? Sean?
I'm wondering why they're reviewing the RTC. More like looking where the increased numbers are, because if you keep below the RTC, you're managing. Reducing that just makes it more difficult to manage. They're low numbers. They're low numbers. The RTC is low numbers, but it sounds like, again, some aren't doing pest control.
Yeah, and so Mark said there's, and they hear it from contractors, so Regional Council put out comms to farmers that the monitoring's about to happen in the area, and the contractors all get rung up. Yeah.
They said it's, it making it, what it does is, I can remember when I first came on the mining committee, I think it was 3 years ago, and the RTC was being reviewed then, and it was reduced, and you reduce it again, so it makes it harder for land trapping and easier for 1080. So the more you reduce it, the harder you make it for people that are making jobs out of this. Just something to consider. People need to do their job when it comes to pest management.
Yeah, that's the dichotomy, isn't it? Thank you, Will. Craig, we were going to have a quick report for you, remember?
If you like.
Yeah, on HBRIC, just an update of what you're doing. So
thank you. We've transgressed HBRIC a wee bit last half hour or so. Just to inform colleagues here, HBRIC's been, there's discussions happening with the Regional Council and the SIPO, which is basically the things that HBRIC are allowed to do, in full consultation with the Council, of course. We have been thinking about some really high-level, longer-term infrastructure type opportunities for investment in Hawke's Bay. There's always these ideas out there. There's never really been an organisation to try and pull them together, particularly one which is so close to a TA such as HBRIC is with HBRC, and particularly with HBRC's strong relationship with the government, or conduit with the various arms of government, say PGF, for example. So we've had a lot of ideas on a whiteboard playing around. Nothing's in concrete. There's been one or two soundings of potential other interested parties, and of course Council will be fully briefed if something does come to the path. But there is a renewed energy and focus and want of action to actually invest in the longer term infrastructure and economic well-being of Hawke's Bay. Some quite large projects which may get off the ground, we'll just wait and see, or some other opportunities that they're presenting them to HBRIC itself because of circumstances for other organisations. So I guess the short message is that there's another breath of wind in the spinnaker of HBRIC, and it is investigating options for longer term investment, as I've said, across Hawke's Bay. But of course, everything would come back through HBRC if there are any significant decisions to be made.
thank you. Any questions on HBRIC for Craig or Neil?
Yeah, I've got a question and another remark on HBRIC. What happened to an idea that was floated with underwriting feed for farmer community here?
I can answer that if you like. We looked at a few of those ideas, and the various drought committee, the Rural Advisory Group, I think, they explored a lot of options. At the end of the day, it actually wasn't required from HBRIC. What did really happen is HBRC, and Ian, particularly in his team, ended up facilitating a lot of that, not having to underwrite it.
Okay.
So they've done God's work actually in that space, still are, and there are still a lot of challenges to come. But interestingly, the willingness of HBRIC to even consider that is quite new to help facilitate things for Hawke's Bay.
Thank you, Craig.
But another comment, Mr. Chair, if that's okay?
Yeah.
You allow me? My name is behind the Hawke's Bay Cycling Governance Group, and it irks me that we actually have a separate group like that from a.
Didn't say you had a minor item.
No, but can I make a comment under this? Will you allow me, Mr. Chair?
Well, could you leave it for next week, or is it important? Really important?
No, it's not that important. I'll leave it till next week. But it will take more time because I'll have more time at night to think about what I'm going to say. Thank you.
It's a good thing to raise these at the councillor meeting. So
Look forward to hearing it.
next week will be good. We look forward to that. Okay. So we don't have to receive those reports. But I think it's really good, especially from the public's point of view who are watching this, to hear from councillors who are outside and doing jobs outside in different committees, and especially the cycling committee. We're going to really look forward to that next week. Great enthusiasm.
Bring your checkbook, though.
Okay. So item 21, discussion, minor items not on the agenda. I just thought it'd be worth raising. We're meeting in regard to Tironga Park, which on the side of Timata Peak, and including the land which the zigzag track used to be on, and still scarring the hill a lot. We're meeting at the Taiwhenua tonight, having a hui with the hapus that are particularly involved, and see if we can come to an agreement on how we move forward. So I just wanted to let everyone know that that's what we're doing tonight.
Good luck. All the best in a positive way.
Thank you very much. So that is the end of our meeting. So Penny?
No, we need public.
Yes, but
okay,
I want to close the public, from the public's point of view. This is our end of our public meeting, so I think we should close it. For the public. And for the public excluded? Well, the public excluded, the public aren't watching, are they?
So through the chair, me ki rā kia whakakapia I tēnei ngā wahanga e titiro mai rā, mata titiro mai rā me ki rā te whānuitanga o ngā tangata o te rohe. Kia tau kia tātou katoa te ata whai I o tātou riki o Ukraiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahi ki te wairua tapu. Ake. Amen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Patty. Patty, could you get the little book that we have?